Welcome to the Hessian Firm podcast. I am your host, Rafael Lecto, and the very special guest that will be talking to us today is John Marmysz, a professor of philosophy at the College of Marin, whose research is mainly focused on the problem of nihilism. He runs the website The Nihilist Void and is the author of several books such as The Nihilist Notebook, Laughing at Nothing, and The Nihilist, a philosophical novel, as well as the vocalist of the punk band Sacripolitical. Sean, thank you so much for accepting our invite and being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Okay, so I think a good way of breaking the ice with our audience would be starting by the curious slogan on your website, "Nothing matters." Can you tell us about that and the implications of that statement?
Yeah, the popular view of nihilism is that the nihilist claims that there's nothing that matters, nothing is worthwhile. My view is that that's certainly true, but there's something ambiguous in claiming that nothing matters. There's an aspect of that sentiment which could lead to despair. If nothing matters, why do anything? Why not just kill yourself? That's one way of looking at the implications of that statement. But there's also a liberating aspect of claiming that nothing matters. I found that sometimes people feel like they're overwhelmed and overburdened by the world, that there's too much on their shoulders. And just reflecting on the fact that in the grand cosmic scheme of things, nothing really matters. Everything's going to decay and disappear, that the world is impermanent. It kind of liberates you to, I don't know, explore a little bit more, to be more creative, not to take things too seriously. Hence the idea of laughing at nothing, that the world maybe is one big joke. And that's not, certainly that can be depressing at times, but it's not necessarily depressing. It can be something that, as I said, liberates you to do interesting things or to enjoy the world.
All right, so I think to give our interview a sense of structure, after this introduction, it would be a good idea to start from the beginning, so to speak. So could you tell us about your journey into becoming a nihilist? When exactly did you start identifying as one, and what were the life experiences and the authors that were particularly important to that realization?
Yeah, I remember reading about nihilism and being introduced to it when I was a teenager. I think it was in high school that I started to become interested in the topic. And as I recall, the origin of it had to do with a lot of the music and the movies and the artwork that I was attracted to. A lot of the adults in my life would criticize the things that I liked as being nihilistic. They meant that in a negative way. They meant that in an awful way. So I was really into punk music. I was into artwork, like the artwork of H.R. Geiger, who did the Alien for the movie Alien. So I was, into paintings by people like Francis Bacon, some very, very extreme sort of stuff. And literature. I was into existentialist literature, the novels of Sartre and Camus and Simone de Beauvoir. So all of those things, the adults in my life, they thought they were dark and negative, and they criticized them as being nihilistic. And I had no idea what nihilism was at that time, but I figured that if everything that I liked was being criticized as nihilistic, I must be a nihilist. And so in my teenage mind, that sparked my curiosity. So what's nihilism? And I started to investigate it in high school. I recall the first serious philosophical work that specifically addressed the issue of nihilism I read was a book by a philosopher, Stanley Rosen. And he wrote a book titled Nihilism, a Philosophical Essay. And I recall, waiting for the book to come into the bookstore. At that time, you had to go to a bookstore in order to, order rare titles. And I ordered this book. It came in a couple weeks later, and I was so excited to dive into it. And I started reading it. I didn't understand what he was talking about. It was very technical, philosophical language. And over the years, I found that I've returned to that book. It's one of those books that my lack of understanding made me want to understand it in an even deeper sense. And so over the years, I've returned to Stanley Rosen's book, and of course, that opened up this entire philosophical world of nihilism to me. So I continued to explore nihilism through the works of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, who's become really, really important to me. Authors such as, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Yukio Mishima, a Japanese author.
Well, he happens to be one of my favorites, actually.
We share a lot in common, I'm saying. Yukio Mishima, for better or for worse, was a huge influence on me as I was growing up from my teens into my 20s, as was Friedrich Nietzsche. Max Stirner was very important to me. So all of these thinkers, in one way or another, started to kind of buttress my understanding of nihilism. And I realized at a certain point that nihilism was a lot more serious than the adults in my life were claiming it was. It wasn't just sheer negativity. There was a whole philosophy, a whole philosophical background to it. And so really, up to this point in my life, what I've been involved in intellectually is trying to understand what nihilism is, and how it is that one can embrace it and utilize it for activity.
Okay, thanks for this explanation. I think there's a lot to unpack here. I find the reference to Mishima interesting, not just because he's also been influential to me. The first time I came across Yukio Mishima was when I was 18, the last year of high school. Confessions of a Mask, quite a revelation. And then, of course, his life and all of those elements that you naturally delve into when you come across the author. And I think it's evident that Mishima deals with the problem of meaning, or the lack of it, the difficulty of finding it in modern societies. And I think you could read his entire life as a reply to that problem, as an attempt at reconquering that meaning. But it's interesting that, and this is just my own personal interpretation, but as I read Mishima, I never saw his worldview as explicitly nihilistic, but rather as something more akin to Greek tragedy. But again, I guess this could be what Nietzsche calls active nihilism.
Yeah, I think but there are points where Mishima does call himself a nihilist in certain books. Like I don't know, have you read Sun and Steel?
Yes, a long time ago. It was around the same time I discovered him, but I never picked it up again, so I don't remember those details that well.
Right, that was one of the first Mishima books I recall reading, and there's a point where he comes out in favor of what he calls a manly nihilism, the ability to, as you've said, to actively embrace the world despite the fact that we'll die, that the world is meaningless. And I don't think you're wrong about the likeness between Mishima's work and tragedy, because his works are, in a sense, tragedies. I mean, everything he writes is, in his life, but it's a beautiful tragedy. There are tragedy, like Nietzsche says, is a way of facing the horror of reality and making it beautiful. It's an aesthetic phenomenon, and for Mishima, I see the core of his life as being this attempt to unite art with action, to take
harmony
life,
of pen and sword, right?
Right, yeah, to take life and to make it into an artwork, to make it beautiful. He's incredibly critical of traditional art in many of his works, because he sees traditional art as an abstraction away from life. It's separate from life. In Sun and Steel, he talks about how it is that writing in particular corrodes reality. So it separates us from reality. I mean, you think about like professors in colleges who their interaction with life is purely through written words or through, academic writing. And the writing is commentary on other writing, which is commentary on other writing. And, rather than actually engaging in life and actually doing something concretely, the academic is more and more separated from reality until they're living in this sort of decadent illusion. And I see, Mishima in that way as, he calls himself a nihilist in the sense of being separated from the truth of reality, but he's also, like Nietzsche, I think he's someone who's wrestling with that situation and trying to overcome nihilism, which is this desire to overcome nihilism it seems to be the overriding desire of those who write about the phenomenon. And that's part of, that's how I've been inspired by Nietzsche and Nietzsche, but it's also where I see myself as kind of like departing from them, because I'm beginning to think that there's no need to overcome nihilism, that nihilism just defines the human condition. Okay? And we're not gods. We're not omniscient. We're always going to be separated from the truth. We're always going to be separated from absolute reality. And accepting that condition, that nihilistic condition as the human condition, I think that there are things that can grow out of that are not necessarily completely negative.
Very interesting. Again, very interesting points. And I'm also glad that you brought up punk music regarding all the nihilistic things you liked growing up. And I'd like to go there a bit because I imagine that since it had such a deep resonance with you, you probably felt that there was maybe an implicit, well, not necessarily a worldview, but an implicit existential position to punk that was analogous to what you were exploring in the realm of thought and philosophy.
Absolutely. I do think that. I think the position of punk music, what I guess I should qualify this, what I consider to be real punk music, is the position of no. It's a rejection. It's not a money-making venture. It's not a business. It's not something for fame or fortune. It's a existential rejection of the world. It's an attempt to express one's dissatisfaction with the state of affairs in reality. That's what I really resonated with as a teenager. In high school, I was kind of a bookish kid who was bullied a lot, and the energy and the anger and the nihilism of the punk bands that I listened to, that was really invigorating to me. It made me feel powerful. It made me feel as though there was a sort of position I could take that would reject everything that was against me. So that's what attracted me to punk music. And initially the bands that I was really into were early punk bands, like Dead Kennedys was one of the bands that I have an ambiguous relationship with, because I had a bit of friction with the lead singer when I was a kid. Jello Biafra. I really loved the lyrics of the Dead Kennedys when I was in high school, but when I met Jello Biafra, he had a kind of arrogance and a dismissiveness about me that led to kind of probably a one-sided feud on my part, because that was a local band.
It's always the risk of meeting your idol, right?
Exactly. That's something that I've learned over the course of my life as well. For me, is that it's a bad thing to meet my heroes. It's a reflection of nihilism, again, that no one lives up to your vision of them. No one lives up to the ideal, and that's what I found repeatedly in punk music. I was growing up in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was a very active punk scene here in the Bay Area. So there was plenty of opportunity to rub shoulders with, people who were in bands that I really admired. And I generally found that I liked the music more than I liked the people. The music spoke to me in a way that the concrete individuals did not. But in general, the punk music, it appealed to that need for me to negate, and that's what I saw as the nihilism in punk music, and it's what led me to get together with my friends and to create our own punk band. In the early 1980s, we first started our band Sacripolitical, which it was an opportunity to express philosophy through music. I still don't consider myself to be a musician. I feel like the band it's an avenue for the expression of philosophical ideas, in particular about nihilism. Now, the other members of the band may disagree with this. I think they consider themselves to be, more musicians than me. But for me, it's an opportunity to emote and to express this kind of negation of the world.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I was precisely going to ask about your experience as the vocalist of Sacripolitical. And a point I was thinking about was, in parallel to your proposal of using humor as a response to nihilism, laughing at the void, do you think that the performance aspect of punk music is a screaming at the void, being the vocalist of Sacripolitical or maybe any other punk band?
Yeah, it is. There is, an aspect of screaming at the void, oftentimes literally, because there's no one there to watch your band perform. It can be, you have like one or two people in the audience. Screaming, screaming the lyrics. The aspect of humor is definitely a part of what I like about punk music. I think, in regards to the distinction between a lot of heavy metal and punk, I think that's why I was more attracted to punk music. I thought it had more of a sense of humor. I know that that's not, across the board correct, because I know some people in heavy metal bands who have, some who are very funny, and they have, very deep senses of humor. But the bands that I was attracted to as a teenager were the ones that were humorous in the sense they were mocking things. They were negating through mockery. So the social commentary was a kind of, laughing mockery of the world and the mainstream world. And definitely Sacripolitical is right in that mold. I mean, our songs, a lot of people get offended by, the sentiments of our songs, especially now as compared to when we first wrote some of them in the 1980s. I think sensibilities have definitely changed, and especially in the punk community, I think it's drifted in a particular direction that I'm not adverse to, but it's different. I think there's when I was growing up, it was a lot more offensive, a lot harsher, and now it seems as though people are a lot more sensitive and a lot nicer. In fact, a friend of mine from way back when came to a show recently when we were playing locally, and he was mixing with people in the crowd, and he came up to me later and he said, "Gosh, punks are so nice today. They used to be assholes and now they're nice." but yeah, that humor, I think, is connected with the nihilism, and it's connected with nihilism in the way that we were initially talking about. That none of the things that people claim in mainstream society really matter, and so mocking them and making fun of them is a way of kind of demonstrating that you don't need to fame and fortune and money. You don't need to be talented in order to have a good time and to express your feelings. So I do see humor is intimately connected to the nihilistic aspect of the music.
Okay, I think it's interesting that you mention heavy metal and the difference between heavy metal and punk music, because I think they do have a different approach, but I think they also share a lot, including the fact that I think they both start from nihilistic premises. It's just that they have different ways, each of them deals with that in its own way. And that's why I wanted to go into, for example, of course, we are entering into highly speculative territory here. But for example, in death metal music, I'm thinking of this because there's a very interesting essay on our website called Monstrous Masses about the relationship with the raw reality of the body. And some bands, some currents of death metal are really obsessed with this very gory aesthetic, the artwork, the lyrics, etc. It's all about mangled corpses. But I think that this is something that we eventually have to take seriously, because there are people who listen to this, as well as, for example, people who watch gory horror movies and exploitation movies. So there has to be some psychological appeal, right? So my question would be, do you think that this obsession with gore and the deconstruction of the body in such media, in exploitation movies or death metal, do you think this is related to this nihilistic recognition of mortality? By that I mean this idea that, so we discovered that this body is going to decay, is going to die, so as a response, let's just do this orgy of cathartic destruction and creative ways of mangling the body and destroying it in whatever ways we can think of.
Yeah, I do. I think you're spot on with that. I mean, for me, just in terms of the contrast between punk and metal, especially like you're saying, death metal, gore grind, is that with punk, I think the emphasis is more intellectual in a way, and in metal, and this is just my impression, metal is more visceral. It's like you said, it's more fascinated with the body, or the base existence. And my relative is her partner is the singer of Cartilage, which is a local gore grind band, and they cover themselves in blood, and I can't understand what they're singing about, but the whole show, it does have a humorous aspect to it, but it is fascinated with bodily dismemberment. Their videos have operations, and it all has to do with with goriness and such. They have a side project called Postnasal Drainage, the very name of which evokes something kind of visceral, this kind of snot and mucus and all of that. And yeah, I think that what you've suggested about the connection between the fascination in that type of metal with the body and gory movies, I think is precisely right. We get so isolated in our everyday lives, like we're talking about with academics getting separated from reality. I think there is something sort of cathartic about coming back to the realization that we're meat, that we're stuff, we're made of material substance that can be torn asunder, it can be recombined, it can be destroyed, and I find that to be one of the things that fascinates me about horror movies. In horror movies, and I noted that you on the Hessian website, there's a piece about say like Lars von Trier's films like Antichrist. The focus that films like Antichrist have, or one of my favorite directors is George Romero, who recently died. His films like Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. There's what those films are successful in doing is reminding us that there's something, how should I put it? There's something beastly and this worldly about human beings. We're not spiritual beings so much as we're physical beings. And as physical beings, to be reminded of that and to get away from these pretensions, these highfalutin pretensions about, having a spirit or a soul and all of that, there is something, again, liberating about that. Like with nihilism itself, there's a view that ultimately nothing matters. I mean, if all we are is meat, all of the aspirations, all of the pretensions we have towards, being godlike and, being, making a difference in the world, it all collapses with death. We're all finite, and that's depressing in a way. But as you see, like in aesthetic transformations of that, in art, in music, in literature, it can also be something that it liberates you, that makes you, feel as though, nothing matters, and so I can make music or I can make a film. Yeah, and I think that that's, for me, that's part of the attraction of, something like horror films or, extreme music that focuses on, bodily dismemberment and all that. And I have to, add on to that, there's something funny about it. When I watch, metal groups perform, we just, recently saw Cartilage play in San Francisco. Everyone's laughing. It feels, it's funny. And I think that has to do with, again, another kind of nihilistic element that I think is part of the whole phenomenon of nihilism, which is, I call it nihilistic incongruity. The nihilistic incongruity is that incongruous kind of like contradiction between what we wish ultimately was the case and what really is the case. So, for instance, in cosmic nihilism, we wish that the universe had meaning, but it doesn't. And so, there's this incongruity between what we wish was the case about the universe and what we actually experience as the case. And that dissonance, it's something that can provoke despair, but it's also the root of humor, because humor has to do with absurdity. It has to do with contradiction. And humor is a way of taking that structural element of incongruity or contradiction and transforming it mentally into pleasure rather than pain. So, to watch bodies being dismembered or listen to bands talking about the, bodily dismemberment, if, without humor, that would simply be a painful sort of process. But with humor, it can become something funny. And for extreme music and for movies, that's what I find, what I find pleasurable about them.
Okay, thank you for these comments. Just a little note that I wanted to add about this whole underlying point of revealing the uncanny element of the human nature about all these films and music that you mentioned. Regarding the different means of bringing about that realization, and of course, again, as couldn't be otherwise, this is just my personal opinion, but when you mentioned Antichrist by Lars von Trier, when I watched that movie, I think a very interesting aspect of the experience was that I actually think that visceral aspect of the gore movies, etc., if anything, that wasn't even the worst part of it. I think what made the most impact on me was the general bleakness of that movie. I think I've never watched a movie so existentially despairing. I think much worse than the gore scenes was the general environment that the movie created, just completely despairing and nihilistic. Not the nihilism we've been discussing so far, but that old-fashioned, more perhaps caricatural, bleak, dark nihilism.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. When I first watched that movie, I sat down with my wife to watch it. And when we turned it off, she looked at me and she said, "That was a really good movie." And she said, "I will never watch that movie again."
Yeah, there you go.
It had that effect. And I agree. It's an unpleasant experience to watch it. It's a pleasant experience for me to reflect on the movie, to think about the movie. I recently wrote an essay. It's in a book called Nihilism or what's it called? Violence and Nihilism is the title of the book. It's a collection of essays on the connection between violence and nihilism. And my contribution was on Lars von Trier's Antichrist, and how the movie seems to track with Nietzsche's book Antichrist. In fact, Lars von Trier claims, I don't know if this is really true, but he claims that throughout his life, he has kept Nietzsche's book on his bedstand. So he's been informed throughout his life by this book by Nietzsche, which deals with the issue of nihilism. And the common thread that ties them together is the view that nihilism is something that we're thrown into. The world that we inhabit is a world that ultimately, it doesn't mean anything. It's filled with pain and suffering. It's bleak, as you said. That's the world of nature, and it's a world that we refuse to accept. So in Nietzsche's book, Antichrist, this is the theme that he's working with. He claims that the Judeo-Christian tradition is an attempt to move us beyond the natural world. It's because we can't deal with the natural world that Westerners have latched onto this view that there must be another world beyond this one, which is actually not filled with suffering, and that is full of happiness and joy. And in Lars von Trier's Antichrist, you see him dealing with that same situation in terms of mental health, as well as the metaphysical issues dealing with nature and heaven. What I found really fascinating about that movie is, that at the end of the movie, you have something like a weird kind of optimism. So, through all of the horrors and the bleakness and the suffering that occurs in the movie, at the end, the male character who's sort of dominating this natural aspect of his wife and ultimately kills her, he's escaping from Eden, which is the genesis of humankind, and he's being overtaken by the forces of nature, which are embodied as these women who are passing him up on the hill. And so, just like with Nietzsche, Lars von Trier, he seems to be presenting a path towards the overcoming of nihilism, a way of getting past this hatred of nature. How do you embrace nature? And to me, more and more, that seems like a real question. I mean, if you think about the world, if you think about the nature of reality, it's awful. There are authors like Schopenhauer, who take this position that, what kind of world is it where you need to, in order to survive, you need to tear apart another living creature and consume it, ingest it? Why would the world be put together that way? Why do we live in a world where, by very virtue of the fact that we come to live, we get diseases and die slow deaths? It seems like the world is poorly designed, if it's designed at all. It's an awful sort of place. Have you ever read Ernest Becker? He wrote a book called The Denial of Death.
Oh, it's on my list. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but it's one of those I'm really looking forward to.
Amazing book. It's an amazing, one of my favorite books. Unremittingly bleak, in its depiction of what the human condition is like. So how is it that we embrace a world like that? That's the problem. Now, you're right. There is a sense in which nihilism recognizes that the world is awful. There's another sense in which I think nihilism also entails a recognition that, not just a descriptive recognition that the world is awful, but a kind of normative assessment that's implicated in the term awful, right? It's like, this is not the way it should be. So like in my book, Laughing at Nothing, I claim that, one of the premises of nihilism is that the world is other than it should be. Okay. It shouldn't be this way. And another premise of nihilism, as I see it, is ultimately there's nothing we can do about it. Right? That's what makes the view nihilistic, is that, yeah, this world is awful. There's really nothing we can do about this. And so, there's a kind of, a bleakness about nihilism in that regard. Mm-hmm. I think the only thing that we can do about it is to choose our attitude about that world. Okay. I don't like it the way it is, but perhaps in my interpretive capacities, I can bring to bear a different attitude towards reality. I can see it as awful and horrifying. I can see it as one big joke to laugh at. Okay. It's like different sides of the same coin. And I prefer the humorous response precisely because it's pleasurable rather than painful. So it's, there is something paradoxical about discovering pleasure through the pain and the bleakness and the awfulness of nature.
Sure. All these comments about the inherent wrongness of the world reminded me of, I think it's a female character in Antichrist who says at some point that nature is Satan's church. The whole movie has this very explicit idea of human nature or nature in general being inherently evil.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And and the female character, she's, as I read the movie, she's intended as an embodiment of nature. At the beginning of the movie, there's the scene where the two characters are in the shower and they're having sex, which was kind of shocking when the movie came out because it's very, very explicit. But I think, the meaning of that is to take the female character who embodies nature, and then the male character who is a psychoanalyst. I mean, he's a therapist, so he embodies civilization, and they're in concert with one another. They're literally interpenetrating one another. And at when they're in that act of interpenetration, when they're kind of like the yin and the yang, they're intermixed with one another. There's a kind of lack of consciousness of the awfulness of the world. I mean, their child, they don't even notice that their child is walking out and falls out of a window and dies. That's the initiating, event in that movie that breaks them ultimately apart. And it's when the male figure who embodies civilization is trying to cure the female figure who embodies nature that you start getting the violent struggle, the awful struggle between civilization and nature. So she, when they go to Eden, which of course, I mean, it's not coincidental that Lars von Trier calls, this place Eden. They're going to the very place where man and woman were turned against one another in the Bible, right? They were in the Garden of Eden, everything, they were unself-conscious until they ate of the fruit, the knowledge of good and evil. So they go to Eden, and the female character is starting to, I think, become conscious of her nature as nature. And it's disturbing and painful, but it's also invigorating to her. And she starts becoming more and more aggressive and out of control the more that her husband, who embodies the forces of civilization, is trying to control her and trying to, be therapeutic and all of that. So you have the struggle, and Nietzsche would call it, Apollo and Dionysus. It's like she's the Dionysian, energetic natural force that can't be contained, and he's the Apollonian structured force that's trying to harness the Dionysian. And so the whole movie is like the back and forth battle between them, and it appears towards the end that Apollo wins because the husband kills his wife. But as I alluded to earlier, that's I don't think that's the final portion of the movie. The final portion of the movie is where he's trying to escape Eden, and he's overtaken by female figures, which again, I think are symbols of this Dionysian natural force. So, what's happening there? You've got the battle between nature and civilization. It seems like civilization wins, but then nature ultimately takes over. That's how I, in a nutshell, read the movie. But that's, also what I found so fascinating about it was that, these Nietzschean themes and this notion of, civilization versus nature. Those are themes that are of great interest to me. I mean, they're in Nietzsche. They're in a lot of other movies that I'm interested in, like Fight Club. I think deals with that same sort of struggle. And I think going back to my childhood, those were things that were going through my mind. So there is something comforting about finding artists, whether they're in music or literature or film, who mirror back to you, the very sorts of things that you're struggling with. Yeah.
Right. I think that's an interesting interpretation of the movie, of Lars von Trier's movie. And this actually reminds me of the Accusations. He's a very controversial director, right? When it came out, there were accusations of the movie being misogynistic. And to be honest, I don't think I agree with that, because it doesn't make a very good portrayal of the male either. So the female represents this wild Dionysian nature, I think. Of course, it's just my interpretation, but I think the portrayal of the male, a civilization, as Apollo, ultimately it's a pathetic, futile figure, because, as you were saying, it's a futile attempt. He ends up being reabsorbed by nature, right? Is overwhelmed by the women on the hill. So the fact that he kills the wife in the end is a very minor thing. I think it doesn't change the fundamental question here. So if he does portray the female as evil nature, I think the male, a civilization, is just a futile and pathetic attempt at running away from that.
Right, and for me, that punctuates the nihilism. It's he from the perspective of civilization, this is not the way it should be. There's nothing you can do about it in the end. Okay, and you're absolutely right about these accusations that von Trier is a misogynist. The funny thing is, reading interviews with him, he admits that he identifies with the female characters, and most of his movies, actually all of the ones that I'm thinking of now, well, maybe not all of them, but a good deal of his movies, female characters are the central characters, are the main characters. I know I identify with, I think I identify a lot with the female character in Antichrist, precisely because she embodies that experience of, a high schooler again, high school John Marmysz, where, feel like I'm oppressed, I'm bullied, someone's trying to keep me in line. And the only way that I can break free of that is by wild abandon, punk, the massive rejection of saying no. And that's what the character in, the female character in Antichrist does. And yeah, I have a huge amount of sympathy for that character. So personally, I don't see it as a misogynistic movie. I don't see him as hating women. I see him as sympathizing with the plight of anyone who's oppressed by convention, by the mainstream, by civilization. And to advocate the throwing off of civilization, of course, has its own dangers associated with it. But I sympathize with that perspective.
Right. I'm glad that we're going through all these cultural manifestations of nihilism in a sense, but I think it would also be interesting to go back to the core issue. So right from the beginning, you've been hinting at this unique interpretation of nihilism, which, as you said, in a sense, it's empowering, right? So in the second question, you were talking about giving up this project of overcoming nihilism and just accepting it. So can you talk a little bit more about this interpretation of nihilism that you have been developing?
Sure. Yeah. Throughout reading about nihilism, reading, classic texts on nihilism and, more contemporary treatments of it, it's not merely my observation that people use the term really loosely. It's used to cover all kinds of ground. And one of the things I was interested in doing was trying to understand, what is nihilism? It's not simply negativity. It's not simply, something that's bad, something that should be avoided. What is nihilism, as a philosophy, rather than just as a sentiment of disgust or a sentiment of negativity. And so, one of the things that I've tried to do, or that I've been interested in exploring, is how I can discover the common thread that various nihilistic thinkers or people who use the term nihilism, what is the common thread that runs through their work? It's, I guess, sort of like, the method of similarities and differences. You read Mishima, you read Nietzsche, you read Jean-Paul Sartre, you read Max Stirner, you read all of these, thinkers, Oswald Spengler, you read all of these thinkers who deal with nihilism. They're very different in many ways, but what is it? Why nihilism? What is it that, is the thread that ties together their discussions of nihilism? And for me, what I've distilled down are three commonalities. There are like three, what I would call them, premises of nihilism that are shared throughout the literature. One is that nihilism consists of this view that the highest ideals are out of reach. So, whether we're talking about absolute goodness, absolute beauty, absolute truth, those sorts of things they're out of reach. And the reason they're out of reach is because they're abstractions. They don't really exist independent of our thinking about them, contrary to what Plato would claim. Plato claims that there are, really ideas. Yeah, exactly. I think in nihilism, post Nietzsche, especially with the death of God, there's the viewpoint that no, there's nothing eternal out there. That when we're thinking about truth and goodness and beauty and justice and all of that, it's a projection of the human mind on to the world. Hegel talks about this in his Phenomenology of Spirit. He talks about the unhappy consciousness of Christianity. The unhappy consciousness, it can't stand being alone. And so it projects onto the world another consciousness and then demands recognition from that consciousness. The reason it's unhappy is that that's not a real consciousness out there that they can be recognized by. So it's an illusion. And that's, for me, the first thing that I see as a common thread in various authors who are writing about nihilism, is that they have this sense that the highest ideals traditionally that humans have striven for, like truth, beauty, goodness, and justice, that we're alienated from them. Okay? That they're incapable of full realization. The second thing that I see as common between the various nihilist thinkers, I think I alluded to earlier, that's a bad situation. Okay, that it shouldn't be that way. Now, there are plenty of thinkers who claim that, oh yeah, there's no such thing as truth, beauty, and goodness, and that's fine. Some people call that nihilism. I don't see that as nihilism. I see that as a kind of reconciliation with the world. It's more like pragmatists, are happy with the case. So it's an abstraction. Who cares, right? But the nihilist, I think, is more of there's more like a kind of romantic element, this kind of suffering element. The world is not what it should be, and so that's what I see as the second part of nihilism. It's what separates the nihilist from, a cynic. The cynic's like, ideals don't exist, heroes don't exist. I had friends like that in high school and in college who are just purely happy with saying, yeah, there are no more heroes. And for me, I was like, no, I want there to be heroes, and there aren't any. So, that's what sets up nihilistic incongruity between what you wish was the case about the world and what you recognize actually is the case with the world. And the third element that I think ties all of these thinkers together in their nihilism is the viewpoint. There's nothing that can be done to change the situation ultimately. So you've got alienation from the highest ideals, the view that alienation is a bad thing, it's not what it should be, and ultimately there's nothing we can do about changing that set of conditions. And so the nihilist is someone who, I guess, accepts those premises as I see it. And there are certainly plenty of people who accuse others of being a nihilist because they accept those premises, but they see that the whole situation as just an inherently destructive, awful thing. But I think there's the alternative of embracing all of those aspects of nihilism and not seeing it as wholly destructive. I think that it's possible to embrace all of those premises and to still say that this is not wholly terrible. It is. I mean, it's terrible in a way. Psychologically, it causes anxiety and pain, and the world looks like a bleak place. But is there a stance? Is there like a mental stance that you could take, which would say that the fact that I see the world as filled with bleakness, suffering, and pain, and not being the way that I wish it to be, and there being no way for me to change that, is there something about that entire condition which is actually positive? And I think there is. I think that it's what can motivate things like metal music or punk music or, literature that describes the situation, or writing philosophy about it. I think it's possible to take that worldview, and I guess what I'm saying is that there's an aesthetic response. There is an aesthetic response that can be taken to the problem of nihilism, and the world would be poorer if we didn't have those thinkers, say, going all the way back at least to beyond the Bible, to the Epic of Gilgamesh, that throughout human history,
the question of mortality, which is already troubling the protagonist. Yeah,
absolutely, and the fact that people struggle with that aesthetically and present it, I like that. I think that's good. I think the world would be a poorer place without Gilgamesh, without without Nietzsche, without Camus, without Spengler, without Mishima. The world would be poorer without them. And so, in that sense, I think that there is something positive about nihilism. Heidegger himself, in his 4-volume set on Nietzsche, the volume on nihilism, he writes that there's really nothing inherently negative about nihilism, and I agree with that. There is a kind of negation and negativity, but negativity and negation are themselves not negative. They serve some sort of purpose, in the human experience. And it would be worse if we didn't have those sorts of things. And that's why, I think that nihilism is, in the sense that I've been kind of laying out, I think it's actually preferable, and maybe I'm going too far here for some people, but I think it's preferable to non-nihilistic views. I think nihilism actually brings people back down to earth. I think it combats arrogance. I think it combats, this kind of utopian form of thinking where you have authorities that get up and say, I have the answer. I know how to fix the world. That's, to me, those are the people that are really dangerous, are the optimists. The optimists are the ones who are convinced that they have all of the answers, and they're willing to, to entangle people in these schemes like wars or politics, various ventures where people die and their lives are ruined in the pursuit of a fanciful ideal that can never be made real. So I think the nihilist is, I think the pessimism, if you want to call it that, of nihilism is far more productive and positive than the optimism of a utopian thinker.
Okay, given your emphasis on these, let's call them truths of nihilism, would you like to single out a few works important to you that reflect this view, this version of nihilism?
So, a few of the literary or film works that illustrate this.
Yes, as you prefer.
Well, we were talking about Antichrist. Lars von Trier's Antichrist has become a very, very, important film in my mind. Something that, like I said, I like to reflect on quite a bit.
I think it's already a classic, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. The works that are really, really important to me because they help me reflect on these ideas, I would say that Mishima's Sea of Fertility tetralogy, I've read that a few times now. It's a series of books that gets deeper and deeper the more that I read them. When I first read them, I was just out of high school. I don't think I understood what was going on, or maybe I had a different sort of understanding. I read them as a kind of illustration of the Buddhist idea of reincarnation. Upon later readings, I think that that's false. I don't think that Mishima, I don't think he was a Buddhist at all. He seems to be very critical of Buddhism, and I think what those books are illustrating is the illusions that we create in order to bear life. I think that's what that series of books is doing. So the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, very important to me. Nietzsche's books, two in particular, I think I would single out: Beyond Good and Evil, another book which, when I first read it as a teenager, I got one thing out of it, and then later, years later, decades later in life, I reread it and I thought, wow, this is not the book that I thought it was. When I first read it, I saw it as this, from my teenage perspective, I saw it as a book that was telling me to be strong and to reject, all the morality, the mainstream ways of acting. When I read it decades later, what I saw was a book to learn to embrace the ambiguity of the world, that the world is not good or evil. It's not male or female. It's not, dark or light. It's all of those things. And that, the subtle thinker is the nihilistic thinker who isn't looking for some sort of resting spot for, their intellectual endeavors, that it's a constant sort of process that we should be going through in assessing the world. And the book Antichrist, which he wrote towards the end of his life, that's the other book that has been increasingly important to me in how it articulates this view that nature is a certain way. Nature is cruel, and that there are all sorts of systems which will promise the escape from nature, and they're all lies. So that book, I think, is one of the works that are really important to me in that regard. Thinking of music, the music that has stayed with me for my life, and it's strange because when I listen to music, it is the nihilism, the nihilistic themes that are important to me, but I think the literature and the film that I consume is less humorous than the music I consume. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I still listen to bands like the Angry Samoans. They're a California band. I think they still play. I think there's one member left. They call themselves the Angry Samoan, singular now.
Oh.
But that's a band that I first encountered as a teenager. And in terms of what we're talking about here with an aesthetic illustration of these nihilistic themes, with the Angry Samoans, you have this complete absurdity. I mean, they sing about absurd things. They sing about bodily things. They have songs about poking your eyes out with forks. They sing about, going insane. But all of their lyrics seem to evoke the absurdity of life, but they're hilarious. So they embody that attempt to take, an absurd situation, a situation which would otherwise be awful and painful, like insanity or poking your eyes out, and they put this humorous spin on it that makes it, pleasurable to listen to and to linger in the presence of. So their music is still really, really important to me. Another band, they're actually amongst my favorite bands. They're a British band that the lead singer just recently died, a British punk band called the Angelic Upstarts. And it's funny because they're not humorous. They're like stupidly serious about singing about, honor and dignity and all of that sort of thing. And I think maybe what they embody to me is the ability to like hold on to these ideals, even though, to me, it's like, it's hard to like really embrace these grand ideals. But this is, a band which when I listen to them, I guess what I'm thinking is, God, I wish I could be like that. I wish I could, really love, this group or, this ideal. So, in terms of music, I guess that's what comes to mind for me right off the bat.
Another topic I'd like to bring up here is, it's interesting that you've mentioned Spengler with his theory of historical cycles, because I think a very prominent feature of our culture, our modern Western culture, is that for the last few decades at least, there's been a tremendous surge in popularity precisely of nihilism, or at least a certain caricature of nihilism or pessimism in general. So, being the focus of your investigation, do you have any thoughts on this phenomenon? Do you agree with Spengler or any of those theories of civilizational decay? What's your explanation, if there is one, of this sudden popularity of nihilism or pop nihilism?
Yeah, it was Gadamer, he was a student of Heidegger's. He said that Spengler, while Gadamer was a student, that Spengler was really, really transformational for his generation. That Spengler was one of the most important thinkers. It's interesting because these days Spengler isn't given much respect. He's seen as not a a careful scholar. When I was in graduate school and I was working on the dissertation, I had started writing a whole chapter on Spengler, and my mentor, my dissertation advisor, demanded that I take that out. Didn't want Spengler in there. But I think there's some recognition now of the importance of Spengler.
You mean academic recognition?
Yeah, so there have been a couple of academic studies that have come out about Spengler. One relatively recently that tries to reassess his philosophy. So I think there is more recognition about the importance of his thought, and I think what the importance lies in is the relativism. He's a relativist. He claims that there are different cultures. Different cultures have different ideals that they aspire toward. The thing that many people disagree with is this pessimistic, bleak view that he has that once a culture has achieved its highest ideals, that there's nowhere else to go, that it has no effect, on other cultures. But this I think the cultural relativist view that he fleshed out, and the viewpoint that in any particular cultural artifact, you can detect the ideals that a culture held as their highest ideals. I think that that's something that it's an important insight, and it's something that I think a lot of people are more and more appreciating. In terms of like the popularization of nihilism, when I was younger, I never thought that nihilism would be a popular thing. And I think part of me wishes it never was. It's the punk part of me. It's like, I don't want punk music to be popular. I don't want it to be successful. I want it to be oppositional. I want it to be on the outside. And I think there's a part of me that feels that way about the philosophy of nihilism. But it's fruitless to fight against it, because all you need to do is look on YouTube and look on there's even self-help books which are nihilistic in nature, which blows my mind. It's like, how did nihilism become popular? I think you're right that part of the way it became popular was the way anything becomes popular. It gets watered down to the lowest common denominator, and so it loses its provocational nature, and that's happened with nihilism. So nihilism has been it's been seen as a description of reality, and so since the kind of waning of religious belief, I think more and more people are apt to think of the world as a place that is lacking any objective meaning, as unthreatening. That it's not the sort of threat that viewpoint, that cosmic viewpoint, is not the sort of threat that maybe it was at one point, say in Dostoevsky's time, right? So, I think that's part of maybe why it is that that nihilism has become more and more popular amongst mainstream audiences. It's also the case that the humorous view of nihilism, well, I guess I shouldn't say humorous, the positive view of nihilism has become increasingly popular. There's a whole slew now of academic books making the argument that nihilism is not something that we should reject or fear, which again, when I wrote Laughing at Nothing, one of the critics of the book said that that only an American would write such a thing. Seeing like this shallow optimism of us Americans, only an American could find something positive in nihilism. Well, it seems now that there's a lot of people, in the UK, in India, who have found nihilism to be somewhat positive. And I think what they're finding positive in it is, what I referred to earlier is this kind of liberatory nature of it. The fact that it can act as a tool of liberation from the types of ideals that weighed people down, the types of expectations that weighed people down in the past. If nothing matters, well, anything's permitted. For Dostoevsky, that was horrifying. But for modern human beings, that's wonderful. Yeah, anything's permitted. You can do anything. And that goes, it dovetails nicely, I guess, with a kind of liberal, cosmopolitanism. There are just all of these different ways of being in the world, and none of them is better or worse than the other. They're all kind of the same. I think that's why so many conservative critics are horrified by nihilism, and they still use the term in a negative way, because they reject that kind of liberal cosmopolitan viewpoint. So I'm ambivalent about the way nihilism has become popular. There's a part of me that thinks, well, yeah, that's what I always thought. But there's another part of me that doesn't want to be part of something that is popular and mainstream. I want to be the guy on the outside, who's grumbling about how the world sucks. And I don't want people to say, hey, I agree with you. I want them all to disagree. Maybe that's childish,
Mhm.
but it's honest.
Yes, it has indeed become very pervasive, which is why I think, well, no production, no work of art or anything at all exists in a vacuum. I mean, it's a very simple insight. So every film or book or work of art that anyone produces is inevitably inspired by the surrounding conditions. So today, if that's the pervasive view, it's no wonder that pretty much every single work that becomes notable is affected by it. Because I think this is actually very interesting. We're talking about Lars von Trier and Antichrist, and I think if you notice it, for the past few years, every time there's a great new author or a great new artist, you can almost presume that his work is going to be pessimistic, right? Or that it's going to deal with the meaninglessness of modern society or whatever. So for cinema, for example, yeah, we were talking about Lars von Trier, but someone like think of someone like Michel Haneke, for example. Well, I think every name we could come up with would pretty much fit this mold in any way or another.
Well, I think it's kind of an odd fact that tragedy or negative sort quote unquote negative feelings are seen as deeper than the opposite. It's like I mean, probably predates Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle, when wrote about tragedy and gave it in his book Poetics this view of, I mean, it's a deep sort of spiritual catharsis that's occurring in tragedy. I mean, he also addressed comedy, but that portion of the book is missing. And so I think in the West, at least, the tradition has been that comedy is shallow. It it doesn't go deep to the human condition, whereas tragedy really, really does, which is, I mean, there's something kind of paradoxical, about that normally we want to avoid, these painful sorts of negative emotions, and yet we seek them out. And I think the reason we seek them out is, because we want to be reminded that we are deep, and that we have, these depths that are, repressed and kept down. So yeah, it's with contemporary artists, I think it makes sense that those that deal with dark, deep themes might be seen as more profound in that way than those that deal with, superficial sorts of themes, or comedic or funny themes. I don't agree with that personally. I mean, I think comedy can be just as deep as tragedy. I think maybe it's
Can you give an example?
Yeah, well, let's see. Fight Club is one of my favorite films.
So you see it as comedic.
I see it as a strange comedy. Yeah.
Okay.
It does deal with dark themes, of course, and with suffering and oppression by the mainstream and all of that. But I find it to be a very, very funny film. I try to watch it every year on my birthday to remind me of things that, yeah, career, appearances, not important, but there's something. It's
almost a spiritual exercise.
Right. And watching that movie, I find myself laughing, and what I think I'm laughing at is not just, the absurdity of the characters in the movie, but I'm laughing at myself, reminding myself that I'm an idiot, I'm absurd, not to take myself too seriously. I'm trying to think of another comedic movie that it's funny, I have to search for the comedic movie that makes my point. And there's like you pointed out, there's plenty of tragedies and dark movies that that immediately come to mind. But I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about the comedic examples. I'm sure I'll come up with some as we're talking.
All right. Even though you've mentioned this watering down as one of the reasons why the nihilistic view has become so pervasive, even then, is there any recent work, nihilist work, that you think has approached nihilism in an interesting way? Any contemporary examples you can think of?
Sure, sure. Just to come back to the comedic movie,
Mm-hmm.
one popped into my mind that I love. I don't know if you've seen a film called I Heart Huckabees.
Oh, I've heard of it, but I haven't watched it.
It's hilarious, and
Mm.
it's the whole movie is about existentialism and the void and the meaninglessness of the world. Um, so it does a really really good job of dealing with those ideas, but in a hilarious way. I mean, there's it of course it has to do with despair, but the patina that's put on the despair of the characters in the movies is one that we're laughing at. So it's the
Mm.
the plot has to do with a guy who's going through an existential crisis, and so he hires existential detectives to follow him around to see
Oh.
what the core of his suffering and despair is. And so they're trying to unravel, his issues, and it's really, really funny in that regard. So, yeah. So, I Heart Huckabees would be my another example of a comedic movie that deals with those types of things. That other one, everything, it just won the Academy Awards. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. That
Mm-hmm.
also is a movie that deals with nihilism, but in a comedic way. And I really enjoyed that. I think I have to watch it again
Mm.
to really kind of tease out all of the elements in it. But it deals with cosmic meaninglessness and how it is that an individual can deal with that. And it's all played for laughs. So contemporary works on nihilism.
That's already one example. That movie.
Right, right. Well, there's a filmic example of a contemporary treatment. In literature and philosophy, there's a whole slew of books on
Mm-hmm.
nihilism now. Um, I'm not sure that I can pull out all of the authors' names, but was it Gertz is one author, a philosopher who's writing on nihilism, not in a way that I agree with, but he has some interesting things to say about it. Um, Probably the best recent book that I've read on the topic of nihilism, I believe it was called Nihilism and Philosophy.
Mm.
Can't remember the author's name. It's from Bloomsbury Press. It came out just a few years ago. And his thesis in the book, which I wholly agree with, and I think he did an excellent job
Mm.
of exploring this, is that philosophy itself is nihilistic.
Mm.
So I wrote a book called it's actually called The Path of Philosophy. I wanted to call it Wondrous Distress, but the publisher didn't like that title. But I make the same sort of argument as this more recent author makes, that in philosophy, what you have is this endless aspiration towards the ideal of truth, and it's never accomplished, and it can't be accomplished because truth is an abstraction. So for thousands and thousands of years in Western philosophy, you've got these individuals that are attempting to articulate the ultimate truth using logic and rationality to do so. They're always falling short. There's always problems with it, and it's part of the ongoing sort of Spenglerian cycle, of going round and
Mm-hmm.
round, ascent and decline. So that was one of the books that I've recently read on nihilism that I thought was especially good. And actually, this collection here, this is from De Gruyter. It's called Violence and Nihilism. So the editors are from Portugal, as a matter of fact.
Mm.
Luis Aguiar and De Sousa and Paulo Stalino. So they brought together a bunch of different scholars to write chapters on the connection between nihilism and violence. And I mean, all of the chapters are really really interesting. The contention throughout all of the selections has to do with the fact that there's something about nihilism that manifests itself as violence. Okay, not only as violence, but there is something called nihilistic violence. And the various authors have different takes on how it is that nihilistic violence manifests itself.
Interesting. Okay, as we're probably drawing to a close, I know this is a cliche question, but it can be really insightful sometimes. So I was thinking about the desert island question. So we've discussed so many references throughout this interview, but maybe to really know what is the most essential, what speaks most deeply to you. In that hypothetical scenario, if you were in a desert island, one that would have a CD player, etc., what would be the, let's say, maybe one or more, the books, the films, and maybe music as well that you'd bring with you?
Yeah. Okay. What would be the films, books or music that I would spend the rest of my days on a desert island with? I'll start with films. So number one, I think, and this is a film that I've been fascinated with ever since it came out when I was a kid. Rollerball, the original Rollerball, with James Caan. Yeah, Norman Jewison was the director. It's have you seen it?
I don't think I haven't.
No, okay.
It's from the 70s, right?
Yeah, 1976, I think, is when it came out.
Okay.
It was remade in, I think, 2000. Don't watch the remake. The remake is atrocious, terrible, complete misunderstanding of what the story is about. But the original story is about it takes place in 2018, way in the future, and the world has been taken over by corporations, and individuality is being quashed out by the corporations. There's no more wars. There's only these violent matches called rollerball. And so the whole movie is this kind of existential meditation on the main character, Jonathan E., who's being told that he needs to stop playing rollerball because he's becoming a star. He's standing out from the crowd. And so the corporations are trying throughout the movie to kill him, to get him to die while he's playing rollerball. I love that movie when it first came out. I still think it's a masterpiece. It's it embodies and illustrates these existential themes. The other movies that I would bring with me would be David Cronenberg's Videodrome, which is his best movie of all time. I don't think that anything he did before or since lives up to Videodrome. And that one, I mean, that's a very visceral, gory, sort of film. And I think what appeals to me about it is, again, this meditation on reality versus hallucination. The main character you're not sure, is he hallucinating what's going on, or is it a transformation in his consciousness? So that's among my favorite movies. I'll say one more movie, maybe a more lighthearted one that I've always loved, Phantom of the Paradise by Brian De Palma. It's
I think it's a very charming one too.
You like that one?
Yeah, I think it's one of those cases where I think it's actually a very difficult thing to pull off, that whole fairy tale stick, in a modern setting. But I think he did it very well.
Right, and I like the inclusion of sort of like the glam rock element, in the movie. It's kind of like Rocky Horror Picture Show or Hedwig and the Angry Inch. But that movie has a really fond spot in my heart because it's both lighthearted, but it also has this sort of tragic element that, I don't know, that's it. It hits a soft spot for me. There's I don't know, there's something about, again, the character who's been abused and sort of oppressed by those around him, but he does something beautiful. He makes something beautiful. So that's another movie I guess I could watch over and over again. In terms of books,
I need to watch it again too. this is making me want to revisit it.
Yeah, it really, for me, it holds up. And it holds up because, it does have a seriousness about it, but it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's lighthearted, but it's not lighthearted. It's got those sorts of contradictory elements in it. But yeah, great movie, and the music is fantastic as well. Actually, yeah, the ending song by Paul Williams, "The Hell of It," is a completely nihilistic song. The song that the movie ends on is he's singing about how nothing matters, and that's the hell of it. That you've been abused and you've suffered and all of that, and that's the way the world is, and you're good for nothing. So that movie ends with that song. So it kind of I guess it cements the nihilistic theme of the movie. Books. I would bring I would definitely have to bring some Nietzsche. So maybe the collected works of Nietzsche. That's maybe cheating, but but with the collected works,
valid.
Right. Then you could, I would have plenty of time to revisit his early, middle, and late works, and to rethink, the whole trajectory of his writing career. Because Nietzsche's, I love Nietzsche. He's probably my favorite philosopher of all times, even if I don't agree with everything in him. But he gives me, I don't know, he gives me a kind of comfort. And on a desert island, I guess I would need that. I would need to feel like I had, someone there with me. And in Nietzsche's books, he feels like he's there. Yeah, because he's quite courageous in the way he writes, because he's, certainly a philosopher, but he writes in a very personal, individual way. And so he really puts himself, out there. So he would be a companion there. Two books that I think I would also bring. I would bring H.R. Geiger's Necronomicon.
Oh, that's pretty unexpected.
Yeah, so that's, in terms of just visuals, that book would, I can gaze at his paintings forever.
I imagine it would be a very nice contrast to the nature of the desert island.
There you go. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And the book of photographs that Mishima did might be the accompaniment to that. We have it up on the Ordeal by Roses. I don't know if you've looked through that, but
yeah, I've searched about it. Yes, it's by a great photographer, Eiko Hozoe, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's not much of a read, but it's something that, again, I think, when I look at the photos, I feel like, I'm seeing something about Misha, like I'm in the company of Mishima. So maybe that would be one that I would bring. Ernest Becker's Denial of Death would be another one. That might put me in a pretty foul mood as I'm out there on the desert island, but it's very real and very concrete. And there's something very honest about that book. He actually wrote it while he was dying of cancer. So it's filled with all of this imagery, which might be out of a gore grind video or out of a horror movie, where he's talking about the excretory system and how all we are, how does he put it? We are anuses with minds. So he's very aware of his his bodily nature as he's suffering through this cancer, and so he's meditating on it, reflecting on it, and thinking about it. So I would include that book, and I guess I'd bring some Mishima and some Freud. I love Freud. Gosh, I could go on and on about the books I would bring. I guess I'm not being very fair by I'm supposed to isolate somehow, but I'll leave that there. Yeah, in terms of music, I would have to bring my collection of angelic upstarts albums, and I'd bring some Sacripolitical. Who else would I bring? I guess I'd bring Angry Samoans. Oh, I know who I would bring. The Feeders. One of my favorite punk bands of all times, Feederz. So the Feeders were a punk band that were influenced by the Situationist movement. And so their first album was bound in sandpaper so that it would destroy anything that it came into contact with. So as you're sliding it in and out of your collection, it would destroy the albums that it was next to. And all of the songs are, I mean, they're vile and vicious, about destroying society, very very hostile sort of lyrics. But yeah, they're one of my favorite punk bands of all time. I saw them play here in Gilman Street, which our band is going to be playing at Gilman Street next week. But when they played at Gilman Street, the Feeders did, they showed up with Frank Discussion, the lead singer, Frank Discussion. He's bald, and he had live cockroaches glued to the top of his head. And he had a dead dog around his shoulders and a dead cat on a noose around his neck. And everyone thought that it was fake, but it wasn't. And it caused quite a controversy. Yeah, it's I think you can find the video somewhere on the internet of it. But yeah, it caused a huge controversy. So one of my favorite bands, not because I would agree with wearing dead animals, but because I like their provocational nature. I like how they're stirring people up. And so on the desert island, I could see myself just listening to their music for hours and running around and being active.
That's interesting because, well, I don't know that band, but I don't remember who said exactly that the situation is international was the only legitimately dangerous intellectual movement. I'm not sure if that's true, but examples like that do support that view a little bit.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the important thing about being on a desert island and being isolated is that, while all of us want to get away from society, at certain points, we also, I think we need some connection. And so to be reminded of, people that are like-minded and that think like you, I think that would be, what would tie together all of the media that I would bring.
Okay, so are there any final remarks you'd like to give our listeners?
Final remarks. I guess at this point in my life, what I would like people to realize is that there's nothing that's all that important. And what that means is you can do anything that you want. I mean, of course, you can't break the laws of physics, but you don't have to fit in. You don't have to do what everyone else is telling you to do in order to live a happy and good life. In fact, I think, since our lives are so short, people should jump in and try to do the things that are important to them, even if they're not important in the grand cosmic scheme of things, to amass some accomplishments that you can meditate on and be proud of. So I suppose that's my last thought.
Okay, so once again, thank you for the interest and the time.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun for me.